To be perfectly honest, I am so glad we cannot convey smells through camera because I had so much garlic in my lunch today. I could still, when you can still taste it. I guess those are the great things about home office. Nobody will ever know. Why did I even talk about this? So in April, I read 11 books, which is a lot of books, and I'm super excited to be here and to talk about all of them. I think all of them had some great qualities, even though some are going to be favorites and some not so much. But let's just get right into it. I'm going to go through these books in the order that I read them in, so there's no specific order to what I am saying. And the first book I read this month was The Marrow Thieves by Cherie Dimaline. I hope that I am pronouncing that correctly. Maybe it's Cherie Dimaline because it is Canadian and sometimes it could be pronounced in French. I don't know. So this book was written by an Indigenous author from Canada, and it is a dystopian world. So something happened. It sounds like a climate crisis kind of a situation, and people have lost the ability to dream except for Indigenous populations. They can still dream, and when people steal the bone marrow of Indigenous people, they can give other people the ability to dream. So what is essentially happening is Indigenous peoples are being rounded up and shipped to kind of residential schools, the same that we had in the past centuries, and their bone marrow is just being tapped and stolen, and people will die in the process. What I absolutely loved about this book was that it was very traditional, so the author is very, very close to her culture, and that really shines through in this book. It has such an appreciation for Indigenous culture and their belief systems and everything in it, and I just loved that. That was just beautiful because you can just feel the love in that situation. But the storyline wasn't my cup of tea. I didn't know this was YA going into it. I just knew it was dystopian, and this was the type of YA that I can't really deal with as much. And it was more magical realism-y, which I guess I could have guessed because bone marrow obviously doesn't make us dream. But I thought that was like the only element of it, but there were some other elements that were in this story. I don't like it when magical realism is used to solve problems. I like it when magical realism or the fantasy element of a story makes a story more complex, adding to the complexities of life. But in this case, the problem was kind of solved in a way that I thought was a little But I think this novel is supposed to express something completely different. It's supposed to express the love that this author has for Native American cultures, and that is definitely a reason I would read this again, because it's just so beautifully written around the culture that she has grown up with, and that you can really feel that love in the book. So I gave this a 3 stars just because I thought it was written well, and this love, this appreciation is in this book, and I just really like that, but the plot not so much. So a 3 stars from me. The next book I read this month was Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas, and this was the prequel to The Hate U Give. So this is about Star's father that we get to know in The Hate U Give, and the story is about Maverick Carter, her dad. I absolutely loved this book. This was, I guess, the book that I didn't expect to love, and I think I liked this more than I liked The Hate U Give. So this book is about Maverick Carter, and he finds out at the very beginning of the story that he got someone else pregnant a year back, and he finds out that he has this kid, and the mother of that child leaves the kid with him and basically just splits because she has postpartum depression, but it's not really recognized. Nobody really knew that it's postpartum depression, and so she just leaves the kid with him and then splits. And so Maverick Carter all of a sudden has this kid, and his girlfriend, who is Star's mom, is obviously very pissed because she's like, how do you have a girlfriend of this other guy, even though they were actually technically broken up when he had the kid with the other girl, or made the kid with the other girl. So his life kind of gets turned completely upside down, and this is a story of how he deals with that and what happens afterwards. And I just thought this was so well done, especially the topic of toxic masculinity. There are just some things in this book where he feels he is seen as weak, where other people are just trying to keep him out of trouble. So there's a lot of people who are trying to keep him out of gang work. They're trying to keep him from dealing, and he thinks they're interpreting it as him being weak, like I'm too weak to deal drugs, but actually it's about them wanting to protect him from having that gang banger life, I guess. I remember this quote from the series Little Flies Everywhere. I'm going to read the book soon, but I remember a quote from the series, and that is, you didn't make good choices, you had good choices. And I really think this book reflected that, because so many people, white privilege and just having privileges in a given system gives you way more opportunities to make better choices. And I feel like this is a really good depiction of that, because he's not in a system that can help him make good choices. He can almost only make bad choices because there's no systemic support for him as a teenage dad. And he needs support. He obviously needs to provide money and or needs to find money for his family, but there's no systemic support, so he feels like he has to find money in different ways that are, of course, not good ways. So I thought that was another topic that was wonderfully explored in this book, and that's why I really, really enjoyed it. So this was actually a 5 out of 5 from me. I really loved this book. I really have to say, I didn't expect to like it as much as I did. I really thought I would like The Hate You Give way more, but I really enjoyed this book way more. So the next book that I read was The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. I know I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. This was a baby. This took me a while to read. It's pretty long. How many pages? It has 514 pages. And I do have to say it took me like the first 200 to 300 pages to really get into the story. At the beginning I was like, okay, the writing is beautiful, and it's absolutely true. This is a very scenic, atmospheric book, and the writing is gorgeous, and that kind of kept me going from the beginning. And then at like page 300 it really got me, and I got completely sucked in and read the last 200 pages in like a few days. And it is about Daniel, a son of a used bookshop owner, and his dad takes him to this place. It's the Cemetery of Forgotten Books, and it's a place where other bookshop owners take care of books that aren't being published anymore, or just that could be forgotten, and they want to make sure they're not forgotten. And so Daniel gets to pick a book, and that is The Shadow of the Wind. He picks that book up from the Cemetery of Forgotten Books, and he's supposed to take care of it. And he reads the book, he loves the book, and then he finds out that there's this stranger out there that's trying to find all the books by this author and burning the book. He, of course, wants to read the other books by this author, Julian Carax, because he just thinks that the books are great, they're amazing. And then this whole mystery unfolds on why is someone burning these books? Why is someone trying to find them? What happened to this author? Because he mysteriously died or disappeared. And so this whole mystery unfolds, and that's basically what it's about. It certainly is an absolutely fun adventure that is written beautifully, and it was a lot of fun writing it, and there were some twists in it that were really weird, and I did not see them coming at all. And I really enjoyed that, because I'm very good at guessing plot lines, and I did not see these coming in the slightest. So that was pretty amazing, and that's what I really liked about the book. However, I did not like the way women were written in this book, because I feel like women in this book had no real character. It feels like the men in the book were the ones to explore everything. They were the ones that had experienced the adventure, and the women were only kind of in this book to be like objects of lust and love. And I understand the context of this time, because this is like after the Second World War, after the Civil War in Spain. So this is like 40s to 50s, spanning that time period where, of course, women weren't doing as much as they do now. But still, this book was published in 2001. You could at least write them differently. You don't have to give them the best stories, but you don't have to make them like objects of romantic storylines and subplots, and I really didn't like that. And what emphasized it for me was that because his writing is so good, it feels like it was romanticizing the male gaze in this book, and that just really irked me, and I had some real issues with that. But in the end, I still did give this book a 4 stars, just because it was an unbelievably enjoyable read, and I think that the atmosphere will always live inside me. I can't really explain it, but I think you know what I mean. But sometimes when you think about a book, you remember like the scenes and the atmosphere and the way it was and the city, and I really feel like I was in Barcelona at this time because it was written so beautifully. That's why it's a 4 star, but I do not like the way women were written in this book. So the next book I finished was The Guest List by Lucy Foley, and this was an audiobook, so I don't have a physical copy. I listened to this and I just enjoyed this. It's a mystery and a thriller. The plot is basically that there's a big wedding on an island in Ireland, and all the guests come to that island, and then there is a murder. But I really liked the way it was written because it was multiple POVs and then multiple timelines. So we had like a jump into the future where they're finding the body, figuring out who was murdered and how that unfolds, and then you always jump back to the same timeline in the few days before the wedding, before someone was murdered. All of this, I mean, everyone has their little dark secrets and dark stories, and it all ties together in the end very well. So I really enjoyed this story. I can definitely recommend the audiobook because it was actually read by Irish and Scottish people, so you heard the different accents, you heard the posh British accents against the Irish accents, and I just absolutely love that. Also read by different people, so you really get a good feeling for the different POVs. So I really enjoyed this, an absolute recommend for an audiobook. I gave it 3 stars because I did guess some plot lines, but I very much enjoyed the audiobook and it was a wonderfully entertaining read. So if you enjoy anything like that, crime, mystery, that's a great book. So the next book that I picked up was Grown by Tiffany D. Jackson. This is also the protagonist on the cover, Enchanted. And this book is about Enchanted, a teenage girl. She's 17 and she wants to be a singer. It's her big dream. And she goes on this like TV thing show, I can't think of the word, casting show. And she meets this famous singer there who offers to mentor her so she can become a singer. This whole thing starts and it's bad grooming situation, there's a lot of abuse, and the book also starts with her waking up with blood on her hands and the singer is dead. So we know this one thing in the future, that this singer is dead and she was there, and then we start at the beginning of their situation and their relationship and everything that unfolds. So this is a very difficult book to get through because it is very explicit on the grooming situation and the abuse that she goes through, and so I was very happy to see that there were content warnings at the beginning of this book, and I would make sure to really think about reading this book because it is very graphic at some points and it is very difficult to get through. And that is also why I think it's very important to talk about these topics, because it really is about that power dynamic between an older male and a young female, and especially if that person is a singer or is famous. And I thought this was super important and such an important topic. However, I don't think it was done very well. So the first half of this book was really good. I thought it was well done, explaining the grooming situation and how Enchanted got into the position that she gets into. I think that was done extremely well, but there were so many plot lines that just didn't make sense. I think they just weren't built up well enough for them to make sense. So the whole situation with the killer and who the killer really is made absolutely no sense to me. There was no build up and there's no real wrap up of that either. So it just feels like a somehow loose end. And then there's a whole best friend situation in this. And if you've read the book, you'll know what I mean. And when you're reading it, you'll know what I mean also. But this whole best friend situation is just done weirdly. And it feels like after like the half of the book, when she finally kind of gets out of that situation, it feels like that was completely rushed, not well thought out, and like the author had to meet a deadline and then just, wrote whatever she thought that she wanted to do or had planned to do, but didn't write enough in between the lines to actually build up the plot lines. And I thought it was really too bad because this was such an important topic, and it felt like the author thought, you know what, somebody needs to write about this is important, but she didn't write it out of passion. That's kind of what it felt like as a reader, and that made me kind of sad because it is such an important topic. So I ended up giving this a 3.5 out of 5 stars because I do think it's an important topic. I do think it is so important to talk about these things, especially in fiction. I really just wish that the plot lines would have just panned out better. So the next book that I read this month was Indigenous People History of the United States, and I loaned this to a friend, which is why I don't have the physical copy here, and I'm so glad I made a conscious effort to read this book. It's a history book on the Indigenous people of the United States, and it is very accessible, and it was an eye-opener. It really truly was. So there were a lot of things about how Indigenous people lived before colonial settlers were there, and then all of the stuff that happened afterwards. But it also talked a lot about the narratives that we know today or that were used by colonialists to basically erase Indigenous cultures. What I thought was really interesting is, if you saw my last wrap up, I finished Obama's A Promised Land in March. And in that wrap up, I mentioned that there were a lot of American perspectives on certain situations that didn't really sit well with me as an American that lives in Germany and also has German culture as a part of their personality. And I just said, well, that's the American perspective. And it was really interesting to hear those narratives in this history book. So actually a lot of the narratives that they talked about, like manifest destiny and it being a promised land, they talked a lot about that, and even how presidents in present days, so Obama, for example, how they use that in order to justify all of these things that the US does. It's an absolute deep dive into US exceptionalism and manifest destiny, and even how the military today uses terms like Native American terms like Black Hawk, and I never really thought about that, how much the wars that they waged against Native Americans, how much they shaped the military today, which was also very interesting because I did grow up with the military. That's the reason that I'm here. That's the reason that I'm in Germany, that my parents met here. Truly recommend this to anyone that wants to know more about the US, especially about these US narratives and exceptionalism and this huge patriotism. This really put that into a more academic context for me, so I really enjoyed this book. And I cannot recommend it enough. So this was an absolute 5 out of 5. I cannot recommend it enough. So the next book that I finished was The Hunting Party by Lucy Foley, and I also listened to this as an audiobook because I enjoyed the guest list so much that I wanted to listen to The Hunting Party, but I actually liked the guest list more than The Hunting Party. Maybe just because I had just read the guest list, I think I didn't enjoy The Hunting Party as much because the scenario was almost the same. So there's a big group of friends that is getting together for New Year's Eve, and they rent these cabins like out in the middle of nowhere, and one person gets killed. You had the same multiple POV situation, different timeline situation, so it was very, very similar. There were different plot twists and different things, but I could guess a lot of the plot twists in The Hunting Party as compared to the guest list, but I think that's because I just had Lucy Foley's style in my head because I had just listened to the guest list. So if you're just in the mood for something, a mystery, a crime, either one of those books is great. I just don't recommend listening or reading them right after each other. Probably not the best idea that I've ever had. The next book that I read was The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, and this was a surprising read. I just saw this on sale and I got it, and I was waiting on other books, and I really enjoyed this. This was just a really fun read. Plot is very, very simple. This book is about a person called Nora, and she is not happy with her life. A lot of things have gone bad, and she takes her life, and then when she's like hovering between life and death, she enters the Midnight Library. And the Midnight Library allows her to test all kinds of different lives that she could have had if she had made a different decision. So she can basically say, hey, if I decided to do this instead of that at one point in my life, what would that be like? And then she takes a book, and that's the alternate life. The plot in this book is very, very guessable, so you can kind of see most of the stuff coming. However, it was written beautifully, and it really is more about the journey and the revelations that Nora has on this journey of like finding herself and finding meaning in her life. It was just beautiful. It was an empathetic book. It made me cry. I think everyone will come out of this book being just a tidbit kinder to themselves. So absolutely recommend. It's a very short read, but very cute and very well done and very nicely written. So I give it 4 out of 5 because I think I will always keep this in my mind. And the lessons that Nora experiences is just sweet and kind. The next book that I read was an ebook. I read it on the Kindle because I couldn't get a paperback version for some reason, and that was The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. And this was a recommendation by a friend that I was talking to, and I was talking to him about Native American DNA and how much I enjoyed that. And he was like, hey, then you might enjoy this book because it is about HeLa cells. So anyone who has worked in a lab environment knows what HeLa cells are. They're this type of cells that is used in all kinds of experiments. And this book is about Henrietta Lacks, who basically donated the cells, because when I heard this, I wasn't surprised, but Henrietta Lacks, of course, did not donate the cells. They were just taken from her, and she, of course, was a Black patient that was dying of cancer, and her family was never informed about the fact that they had taken these cells from her and that they had become like this international thing. They only found out 20 years later. So, didn't surprise me, but still a horrible thing. And this book is basically about Henrietta Lacks' life and her family and how everything unfolded, and just this hypocrisy of they took these cells from Henrietta Lacks, and these cells helped all kinds of medical marvels. Really, truly, all kinds of medications and vaccinations were developed with the help of these cells, and it wouldn't have been possible without these cells. And yet, Henrietta Lacks' kids couldn't even access basic healthcare, and still cannot, because that's the way the country is today. And it was just a really interesting read about her family and the background. And then also Rebecca Skloot, the author, also touched on tissue donations in that time, in that context, and what it's like today, if today you're informed or not informed, and what does it even mean to donate cells? Are they then forever your cells, even though they've been curated and used in a lab? Do you still have ownership of those tissues or not? So some very interesting questions were raised. So anyone who works in a lab environment or works or knows someone that does, I really recommend this book to all scientists. I thought it was a very interesting read, but it wasn't like exceptional writing or anything. It was very informative. So I give it 4 out of 5 stars because the questions raised in it are just really, really important. And any scientists here definitely recommend. The next book that I read was The Invisible Life of Addie Larue. The books finally arrived. They arrived like in the last week of April, so I just barely read these. I don't know, this story sounded so interesting. So it's about Addie Larue, and she basically makes a pact with the devil, and she's immortal, so she can live forever, but she cannot leave a mark on the world. So everyone forgets her as soon as they leave her line of sight for more than, I don't know how many seconds or minutes. They just completely forget about her. She can't write anything down, and she can't text because she can't leave a mark on the world. So even if she accidentally breaks something, that thing will unbreak itself because she cannot leave a mark. An interesting read. I thought it was absolutely fascinating, because if you really think about like what it means to never be remembered, you can like never get a home because the person renting the place would never remember that they actually rented it to you. You know, all of these little things, you can never have a permanent home. You never have the same place to stay. You can't have any attachments. And of course, that was like one of the things that she accidentally asked for, that the devil like reinterpreted for her. Anyone who's read Faust will know what that means. It was just so well done. And so the first half of this book, I really, really enjoyed the first half of this book. I thought it was really cool to like see her life unfold through the different centuries. And then the second half of the book, because she then all of a sudden meets a person who can remember her, and then it's like, why can he remember her? I didn't necessarily like that plot, and I didn't really like the ending of this story, but the writing was absolutely beautiful, and this book is one of those books that conveys a feeling. So while I was reading this, I was actually so immersed in it that I was kind of paranoid about like, can people remember me? Oh my God, what mark am I going to leave on the world? Like, am I going to be permanently remembered or not? Every once in a while, I'd like get up and walk up to my boyfriend and just cuddle him and be like, I am so grateful you are actually here. Which just speaks to the writing and how much I fell into this world that V.E. Schwab created here. So even though I didn't really like the plot and the way things ended, I kind of see that it was the best ending possible, and I kind of see that some of the things that she did, they didn't really tickle me plot-wise, but the world that she created in this was just so pretty, and it gave me certain feelings. And I think everyone who has read this book definitely will afterwards think about the mark that they leave on the world. Like, what are the things that I'm going to do with my life? I just have such a deep appreciation for that. I'm like actually getting tears in my eyes that this book still had 4 out of 5. That I don't think I'll hold the characters close, but I will hold the lessons of this book close to my heart. So I still gave it 4 out of 5. So this is the book that I just finished this morning, so the last book of the month. I didn't think I would actually be able to read this, and I am amazed that I made it. And this is What's Mine and Yours by Nema Coster. I don't know. Coster, probably. This book is a multiple POV, multiple timeline book, and sometimes it was a little difficult to follow the timelines, but mostly I understood it. It's about school integration in like the most, and that's more like a backdrop because that's what I was reading about a lot online. That's why I think in the TBR I said it was about busing, because that's what I had in my head about school integration, but that really only is a backdrop of this family drama. And it's really difficult to explain this in a few words, but it's about a family and another family and the characters in those different families and how their different lives just, unfold and how everything happens. And there's kind of this school integration issue, and that is a turning point for some of these characters, which is why I think that was always on the blurb, because that really shaped a lot of these characters and like what they were going through. But in the widest context, this book was about racism, LGBTQ. There were so many topics in this. Substance abuse was another topic in this book. So there were so many different topics, and I think this story kind of lost itself in the whole context of everything. What did I like about this? I liked the portrayal of racism in this book, because I think a lot of modern day racism is the way it is portrayed in this book. So a lot of racism that people are like, well, that's not racism. You're not calling anyone the N-word, so they're not a racist. And there was a lot of that more subtle, systemic type of racism in this book, and I think that's a very important thing to talk about. And what I also liked is the generational issues that come with things or trauma like racism. Because I think a lot of people forget, or at least I've heard a lot of this narrative that, well, slavery is over, what else can you complain about? But people really forget the trauma of those experiences on families and how that trauma can be handed like from one generation to the next, and how it takes several generations to actually heal from those experiences. Because obviously something like slavery will do horrible things with your mental health, and then raising kids also is more difficult than a person who has great mental health. And so we're always passing trauma on to the next generation, and I really love books that highlight that and show how we can pass on these different issues that we actually have in our family. The other thing is that I also thought the characters were very well built up, at least the main characters, because otherwise you wouldn't have been able to understand that about this generational trauma. So I think Nema Coster did a wonderful job of building up the characters as well and working with the different timelines, and I think that really worked. It just didn't feel like the book tied together very well, and it's really difficult to explain, but it doesn't feel like the book knew what point it was trying to make. And even though the characters were built up very well, I didn't really empathize with any of them. I didn't really care for any of the characters. I didn't really feel for any of them, except for the person that gets killed in the very first chapter or very two. That was like the only person I really was like, oh, that just sounds like such a nice person, and then they're dead, and I'm like, well, okay, I mean, and I can obviously understand that would do horrible things to the family, but I couldn't empathize with anyone else, so I wasn't very emotionally invested in the story, which I think is too bad, because to not just tell the stories, but feel their stories, and I didn't feel like I felt their story about any one of these characters, which I find too bad, which is why I give this 3 stars. I still really like this read, and I still recommend it if you like that type of racism, social issues that we have over multiple POVs and multiple timelines. If you like that, then this is your dig, so that's why I also enjoyed it, but I just didn't feel it, which is too bad. But I'm definitely going to keep watching Nema Coster. I hope I keep saying that right, because I think she's going to write great things in the future. That is all. Oh my god, how long is this video going to be? I think I've been filming for an hour. That's what happens when you read 11 books. I tried to give good reviews and good insights, and I guess that just takes a while. Yeah, let me know if you've read any of these books, if you have different opinions and ideas about them in the comments. Let me know. I am so interested in hearing your opinions too. If you don't know my TBR for May, you can go check out that video, and otherwise I will see you next week, probably for my first reading vlog ever with The House on the Cerulean Sea. So I will see you then. Bye bye.